time and respect everyone's time. My name is Allison Pulliam, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Declaration for American Democracy. And my other co-director is Christine Wood, who is here as well. And we're an anti-oppression coalition of 250 organizations that are working together to make the promise of democracy real for all of us. Together, we worked to try to move the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act through both chambers of Congress. Almost got final passage. You may have heard about it. Filibuster. But there was a lot of good work done for that. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today is how do we work through those types of challenges. So I'm really excited to welcome you all to our panel discussion, Creative Solutions, How to Pass Anti-Corruption Policies in a Gridlocked Congress. You would have almost thought we were mind readers or could see a crystal ball as for that. But this panel is part of the Building the Path Towards a Fair and Sustainable Future track here at IACC. And we're going to seek to discuss the question, how can we make progress on combating corruption when there is no path to passing federal legislation through Congress? And how can smaller, more incremental reforms help build towards winning sweeping pro-democracy reforms? And with us this morning, we have a really fantastic group of panelists who are gonna really help us dig into this topic. We're gonna hear from them on how to work in coalition to accomplish some of these tangible reforms while also building towards passing even bolder, more transformational policies during the next opportune moment. And we'll also discuss how these policies intersect with other issues related to human rights, including our ability to tackle climate change, for example. So joining us first, all the way down at the end from Public Citizen is Lisa Gilbert, who serves as the Executive Vice President. And then next to her, we have Justin Kwasa, who is the Voting Rights Project Director from the League of Conservation Voters. And then next to Justin, we have Gabe Lezra, the Federal Policy Manager and Senior Counsel for Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or otherwise known as CREW. And then lastly, we have Leslie Proll, Senior Director, Voting Rights Program for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Thank you all so much for being here. And let's dig in and get started. So for all of our panelists here, and we'll start at the end with Lisa. If you could introduce yourself, just give a brief overview of your organization and your title, and then discuss how your organization is approaching democracy reform going into this new Congress, which is expected to be gridlocked. And we'll start with Lisa from Public Citizen.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Allison. It's fantastic to be with all of you and to be at IACC. As she said, I'm Lisa Gilbert, Executive Vice President at Public Citizen. Public Citizen has been around for 50 years. Our mission is to take on corporate power. We have members and supporters all around the country, over 500,000 individuals who support our work, and we are incredibly multi-issue. So not only do we work on democracy, but we also work on the environment, on regulatory policy, on healthcare, civil justice, you name it. If there is a corporate bad actor on one side of the equation and the regular public on the other side, you'll find us wading into battle. But we have always really felt that democracy reform is a critical part of our mission and our work because, if we can succeed in tackling the systemic inequities in our democracy, we'll have a chance to win on all of the other policies we work on. Whether we're thinking about healthcare or improving the environment, until we have equal voice for regular people, until we are not, outweighed by corporate special interests and what they bring to bear, we really won't have a chance to win. And so that's why we've prioritized democracy issues for our entire 50-year history, working on voting rights, and of course working on getting big money out of politics. So, as we think about, taking on this issue, taking on democracy in this moment where Congress is gridlocked, where we're not expecting to be able to pass large, sweeping reforms through that pathway, we think it's incredibly important to do two things. First, important to build power outside of DC. In the states, I'm sure folks have heard the phrase, the laboratories of democracy. It's important to be able to win things, outside of Washington, see change happen around the country, and then bring that to bear here in DC, showing that this change is possible. So that's, one of our strategies at Public Citizen is to try to work in that way, outside of Washington. And then the other part of our strategy is to make sure that we win incremental reforms through the White House. So we absolutely believe that the Biden administration can do things now, that it's critical that they do things now, that we win reforms, not only to show that incremental change is possible, that victories are still possible, but then also to take us on this pathway towards sweeping reform at the next moment politically when it's achievable. So as I sort of think about our strategy right now, it's that sort of twofold plan, build power outside Washington and then win small things here. So I'll stop there and pass it to Justin.
Justin, if you could go ahead.
Hello. Oh, sorry, is this on? Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Kwasa. I'm the Voting Rights Program Director at League of Conservation Voters. We're an environmental organization, mostly working in domestic policy, making sure that we work on everything from clean air, clean water, public lands, and other environmental issues. One of the things that we believe is that one of the things that we really believe in is that everybody wants clean air, clean water, clean environment to live in, and we think that the fact that that is not a reality in our country is the clearest example of democracy failure. And so that is why, as an environmental organization, we are so connected and want to work in the democracy space, in this space, because it's connected. We have the saying that says you can't have a healthy environment without a healthy democracy. And so ultimately what that means is that regardless of what the will of the people are, if we don't have the systems in place in order to respond to and react to what the people want, what the people need, we are not going to be able to make any progress on our environmental issues until we make the game fairer for all people to be heard. And so that's why, as an environmental group, we strongly invest both in voting rights work as well as now we're expanding into the larger democracy work with some of our fellow organization over here. So the only other thing I say is that I think, in particular, LCV is a little bit different than other environmental organizations in the fact that we have a strong investment in kind of on the political arm, and so I think we do a lot with working with candidates. We have a scorecard that basically lays out and gives a ranking for all our federal legislatures, saying saying how good they are on environmental issues. So I think because we work so much in the political space, that makes us more apt to then go and talk about democracy, talk about voting rights, and it kind of led to where we are. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means, but just a little idea of who we are as an organization. So,
Thanks so much, Justin. Gabe?
Cool, yeah. Thank you, Justin. Thanks, Lisa. It's great to be here. DFAT has been just a wonderful organization to be partnered with. And I'll just say off the top, my family is half Spanish and half Moroccan, so you can tell how much I care about this work, that I'm here despite the World Cup game that's going to be starting at 10 a.m. between my two countries. I'm Gabe. I work at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. I'm a crew. I'm going to call it crew from now on. I am their federal policy manager in one of our senior councils. So I sort of oversee and work with our policy team to develop and then push for policies and laws and all these other things within our sort of ambit. CREW is a 501c3 nonpartisan, anti-corruption, good government, campaign finance, and general anti-corruption organization that works in the domestic space here in the United States. We are a sort of small organization that focuses mainly on effective and impact litigation in the campaign finance and a couple other spaces. And we also do a lot of now policy work in our space. We are focusing a lot at this moment in time on kind of thinking our strategy with respect to some of these issues because of a couple of different sort of realities. First of all, obviously, we have the divided Congress, so we're not going to be likely passing large, huge, sweeping legislation, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we've also seen a noted problem and impact in the courts. We've been doing a lot of pro-democracy litigation that we think is really important, but we have to be very strategic about where we litigate and what battles we choose to fight so that we don't create bad law as we fight the good fight, so to speak. So that's part of our thinking right now that we're working through. When it comes to fighting for an effective and ethical democracy and fighting to pass anti-corruption policies, we are looking at sort of two different main things as a organization that doesn't do grassroots work. So a number of these other my panelists and colleagues, their organizations do work trying to rally public support around certain policies. Our goal really is to both sort of pass these policies, but also sort of socialize these ideas that we've had over the long term. So as we look at the divided Congress, I see sort of two main pathways that CREW is looking to take. Obviously, we're looking to convince the White House to pass effective anti-corruption policies via executive order, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The other thing that we're focusing on is the extent to which we can pull out individual legislative ideas from some of these larger sweeping bills that we think might be able to get bipartisan support in the new Congress. And that's an ongoing thing that we're evaluating, but we do see a lot of avenues for finding, for these things to pass. We just need to figure out how to create and manipulate and use our coalitions and partner organizations to find ways to make that work. And I think one of the big successes that we've had over the last year that you all might be familiar with in that space specifically is we've working on something called the Enablers Act, which is a big anti-corruption bill that would require enablers like lawyers, private equity folks, corporate formation agents, and money transfer folks to do and conduct basic anti-money laundering checks. And what we found is there is actually a very large and bipartisan coalition in favor of that type of anti-corruption work. For example, the League of Conservation Voters and various big unions are on this side, as well as folks like Mike Pompeo and the Republican sort of national security establishment. So those are the types of things that we're looking to pass. And right now, the Enablers Act is sort of at this crucial juncture, which will determine whether it ultimately gets passed in this Congress. And if it doesn't, we're going to try to bring it back in the next one. So that's one of the kind of examples of the types of things that we're looking to find and push forward in this new environment.
Thanks, Gabe. Leslie?
Sure. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Leslie Proll, and I'm the Senior Director of Voting Rights at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And this is just an awesome conference. I'm learning about everybody who's here and what you're going to be listening to and participating. So thank you for coming this morning, and thank you to DFAD for inviting me. They are a stalwart partner of the Leadership Conference, and we appreciate all the work you do. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Leadership Conference. We're the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization and civil rights coalition. And right now we are powered by 230 organizations and protecting and securing democracy is one of our top priorities. We are protecting the ability of everyone to participate in the political process, regardless of race, ethnicity, language, or ability, being able to cast a ballot and have that ballot count. And we've been involved in every piece of voting rights legislation that has been passed by Congress, starting back in the 50s. And so I wanted to start today by kind of talking about that long view. You know, civil rights legislation often doesn't happen in 1 year or even 2 years. It often takes several years to pass. And we're in it for the long haul. And some of the things that we are trying to do now, and you may have heard about some of these very bad Supreme Court decisions that have come down in recent years, really striking main provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 1965. And a big case came down almost 10 years ago that gutted what we call the heart of the Voting Rights Act, that required jurisdictions all over the country with histories of discrimination, particularly in the South, to pre-clear any voting changes that they were going to make to the Justice Department or a federal court. And the Supreme Court, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, essentially eviscerated that requirement for a lot of legal reasons that they claimed. They were, you know, we contend they were wrong about it. But we've been trying to fix that decision in Congress for almost 10 years now. And that is what was the topic of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that was referenced earlier. And since then, we've had other cases come down that we've added into those bills. And right now, you should know that the Supreme Court is hearing 2 more cases involving democracy. There's another Voting Rights Act case, and tomorrow, I'm actually going to the argument. There is a big case involving the ability of state legislatures who are claiming kind of exclusive power to dictate what they can do with respect to federal voting rules, and they are arguing that state courts, governors, ballot initiatives, state constitutions really aren't able to address partisan gerrymandering, voter restrictions, and other anti-democratic action. And so we're in a fight. We're in a fight with the Supreme Court about what they're doing to federal voting rights laws, and we have to keep going. We can't sit these 2 years out because there's a gridlock Congress. We made a lot of progress, as was already referenced at the beginning of this year, actually, when we got further than we had ever gotten on getting federal voting rights protections. We did not get across the finish line, but we need to keep charging forward. And you know, we need to be strategic, we need to be potentially incremental about it, but we also need to take it to both sides of the aisle. The thing about the Voting Rights Act is it's always had very strong bipartisan support. Every time it's been reauthorized by Congress, basically renewed by Congress, it's been done with overwhelming majorities. And every time that's happened, it's been signed into law by a Republican president. And the last time it happened was 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. The Senate passed it 98-0. And I went over to the Rose Garden in the George Bush administration and watched him sign the law. So we need to take it to both sides of the aisle to say this is a democracy issue, this is not partisan, we need your support, and we're going to continue to fight. On the executive front, where I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what we're trying to do with the Biden administration, absolutely. while we work Congress and try to advance our agenda and not let anything backslide, we need to press the administration to do all they can, really in view of the fact that we don't have these federal voting rights protections that we had for a very long time. The need is even more imperative and urgent on this administration because we are so missing what we have had for decades on the books to help protect against voting discrimination. So I'm so excited you're here today, and look forward to having a more detailed discussion about all of this.
Thank you, and thank you so much for everyone for those really amazing openings. And Leslie, I'm actually going to reference you again. As you already mentioned, you all have been working to push the Biden administration on some things. You led the work to get President Biden to issue the voter access executive order. And now you're doing the really important work, the leadership conference, of working to hold the administration accountable for the actual implementation of that. Could you talk to us a little bit about that effort, and specifically, how are you following up on the implementation piece? What does that look like?
Sure, I didn't know I'd be back up so early, but absolutely. So this is an executive order that President Biden issued on the anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, Bloody Sunday, which is what we commemorate every year. It was the event where protesters were met with violence by police in Alabama, and were almost threatened with their lives. And it was the impetus for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It's a sacred day in voting rights. Bloody Sunday is what we call it. And President Biden issued the executive order on that day during his first year in office, okay? The executive order was designed to promote access in voting. And I am very complimentary about the content of this order. It was very visionary and comprehensive. And I'll read a kind of the overarching theme was, it is the responsibility of the federal government to expand access to and education about voter registration and election information, and to combat misinformation in order to enable all eligible Americans to participate in democracy. It was also very responsive because voter registration still happens in disproportionate amounts in terms of interference, impediments for communities of color. And so it's something that everybody is concerned about. If you can't register, you can't vote. So it's kind of the beginning of the spectrum to participate in democracy. And so it had a number of directives. I said it was very comprehensive. It essentially directed every federal agency to consider ways that they could promote voter registration and participation. They had to develop a strategic plan and deliver that plan to the White House within 200 days. And I just want to step back. This was very, very different and innovative for the reason that it wasn't just focusing on one agency, like the Department of Justice that you would normally associate with voting rights. It said every agency has an obligation to see how they interface with the public, what they could possibly be doing to promote participation in democracy. One of the things that it did was directed the GSA to improve and modernize vote.gov, which is the essential primary source of voting-related info for the federal government. The idea was to modernize it, to make it more accessible to voters with disabilities, to make it more accessible to people who speak different languages. That was a centerpiece of the EO. It was supposed to analyze barriers to voting for people with disabilities, provide access and education to those in federal custody, establish a Native American steering group to outline recommendations, and importantly, it directed federal agencies to assist states under the National Voter Registration Act. And I don't know if you know, but the National Voter Registration Act came out in the early 90s that essentially directed states to be much more active with registering voters. And you may know that Department of Motor Vehicles, now, anytime you go to get a license, renew your license, they ask you if you need to update your registration, if you want to register to vote. It's kind of embedded into our democracy now. This executive order wanted to take that to the federal agency level and help federal agencies become accessible for promoting registration and voting. So where are we almost 2 years into this? Not as far as we wanted to be. And that's just a shame because, as I said earlier, we don't have the federal voter protections that have been on the books for a very long time because the Supreme Court keeps chipping away at them. And so we really need this administration to step up and implement this order, which is very, very good, but it's only as good as its implementation, right? We sent them a letter earlier this year. Every agency, it was over 100 national groups signed on and said, we need you to do more. We really need you to seize the spirit of this executive order and to make sure that you are thinking creatively and strategically about everything you ought to be doing. For example, the Department of Homeland Security could improve the voter registration that they do at naturalization ceremonies. That's something that we're wanting to see more of. Promoting civic engagement among young voters, there's a lot the Department of Education could be doing, especially with people, we saw this election, the youth vote showed up and spoke out. There is a lot more the Department of Education could be doing to help students register, to navigate that whole issue about when they go to college, where can they register, do they have to stay registered at home, can they re-register near their dorms. There's all those types of issues to resolve. Only 2 federal agencies have offered themselves up for designation as a voter registration agency under the National Voter Registration Act. Only 2. They've had about, almost 20 months to do that. And we only have 2 agencies that have done that. So we have a long way to go. Also, Health and Human Services, one thing that they talked about doing was potentially connecting everyone who signs up for health care at healthcare.gov to have some sort of way to register to vote and get information about registering to vote. They haven't done it yet. And so we have a very large coalition working on this. We are taking it agency by agency, and I'm so glad to hear and see the League of Conservation Voters here today, because it's an example of what we are doing and what we are trying to do more of is getting other issue areas, other communities engaged around democracy issues. Because as the Supreme Court said very long ago, that the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. And if we don't have the right to vote, we can't accomplish anything else. And so we're using this executive order as kind of a model for including other communities, other organizations, to push forward and make sure that every agency is being as responsive as possible. It's also something we're involving members of Congress in. They care about the executive order. In fact, some members wrote a letter to the Biden administration asking that the Biden administration adopt the executive order. And they have been watching and monitoring how these agencies have been implementing it. So I think that's a model for us too. When we think about executive orders, we think, oh, what can we do with the administration? we're only talking to Congress about legislation. We can be using the members in Congress who are pro-democracy to help us strengthen the implementation of the executive order as well. So we remain optimistic. We're going to continue to urge them to do more, to call them out when we think they're not meeting their mandate. But I'm very thankful to be able to come here today and share our work with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And to kind of continue on to that topic of executive orders, I'll turn to Gabe from Crew. Gabe is one of the working group leaders for the DFAT policy working group. You were really instrumental in helping create DFAT's executive order memo and specifically narrowing in on what those policy issues were going to be. So can you kind of provide an overview of that memo and talk through how you and the working group kind of made some of those decisions about what to prioritize and balancing all the different needs of a wide coalition, which we know is not easy.
Yeah, that was not easy. What we're referring to is a memo that we sent to the White House with a series of recommendations of actions that they could take via the president's executive authority to implement and push for new democracy protection and anti-corruption and sort of systemic reforms. Obviously, these were limited in the sense that there's only so much you can do with executive authority. So I think it's worth pointing that out right at the beginning. I think what was really impressive and what we managed to do with the memo was really key was that it was sort of a distillation of all of DFAD's priorities and that we thought generally could be done. But I think the key thing that we started with was trying to figure out how our priorities could be sort of fit in with the commitments that the White House had already made and statements that the president and others in the administration had made, right? Including commitments that we may see new ones during this conference, actually. So that's something that we'll be looking for as well. And how to fit our priorities within sort of the framework that the White House had created. So we decided ultimately to frame the memo and sort of to frame DFAD's priorities for executive action moving forward within the scope and using the same framework as the White House Democracy Summit last year. And there were, a number of categories of things that they used that we then used, right? It was protecting and strengthening our elections, justice, equity, and the rule of law, building an ethical and accountable government, and ultimately combating corruption. And in general, we found that most of our priorities could fit within those, each one of those categories, though, obviously sometimes you had to squint a little bit to make it work. But yeah, the hardest thing about doing something like that in a coalition as broad as DFAD is that it was hard to satisfy ultimately groups that had very different individual issue priorities and groups that had different strategic beliefs, right? How do we make change? And that was complicated. It's not an easy thing to do. And frankly, the executive action, the limits of executive power was actually quite useful in that circumstance because a number of the groups that might otherwise have pushed for much more aggressive strategy, we had to limit everything. We had to rein them in a little bit because there's only so much that we could do there. So we went into the process and sort of asked folks to come up with their own policy ideas, priorities that they had, and then to sort of bring them to everyone else. And so we had these series of meetings where folks would sort of present their own ideas and policies that they wanted to have the coalition recommend. And then we would have, when we had all of those together, we had a number of meetings where we decided which of those policies actually could be accomplished by executive order, And then we had a series of meetings about whether those policies made sense within the framework that the White House had put through. So there obviously are always some tough cuts when it comes to that stuff. But in general, we found that everyone's policies could fit in. So ultimately, we had to deal with some folks who were a little bit unhappy with it. And sort of the way that we did that was accepting that maybe we would do some of that work down the line a little bit. And I think the key thing that we focused on with some of the folks who were unhappy that we weren't pushing for their priorities in executive action was by ensuring that we are going to do that work now, right? Now that we have time to step back and pull out ideas that perhaps we could push forward through legislative vehicles. And a lot of the kind of disagreement within the coalition during this process was about whether we could get legislation through that would accomplish these goals, especially in the circumstance where the coalition was divided as to whether we could actually accomplish them by executive action. And I will say that there is a real disagreement within every coalition, with every group, especially in this circumstance, about the extent to which we wanted to encourage the administration to use their executive authority. And the reason I bring this up is that a lot of our groups are very skeptical of executive power. We felt that, Crew certainly feels that way, that the expansion of executive power in the 21st century is generally a bad thing. That we've seen the sort of imperial presidency abused to do terrible things, especially abroad. And so there was a disagreement in the coalition about the extent to which it made sense to encourage the White House to sort of expand the possible boundaries of what executive authority could really do. And ultimately, we didn't resolve that disagreement. We chose a series of actions that I think ultimately remain within the scope and the ambit of executive power that has already been outlined, that has already been accepted kind of generally. And we actually made a couple of suggestions that would rein in executive authority, or at least bring transparency into that process, including by reforming the Office of Legal Counsel, which, if folks aren't aware, is sort of the shadow legal authority behind all of the executive branch, right? If you have an agency that wants to know if they can do something constitutionally, they will ask the White House to ask the Office of Legal Counsel to create an opinion for them. And the Office of Legal Counsel, especially again in the 21st century, has been really abused to essentially create an avenue for any agency to do whatever they want under the Constitution. The other element of the Office of Legal Counsel, and this is what we recommended, was that the administration publish all of the Office of Legal Counsel memos, all of these Office of Legal Counsel opinions, so that we as the public can actually see what this sort of shadow agency is actually saying and allowing the government to, within the scope of like being not divulging information that would lead to people being injured or whatever, right? It's high top secret stuff. So that's one of the things. And then once we had kind of decided on the set of ideas that we wanted to push forward, we actually met with the White House and we presented them to them. And they were lukewarm on some of them, they were very interested in others, and they asked us to come back and present them with a more detailed analysis of a series of ones that they found particularly intriguing. But I'll just say, just in closing, we can keep talking about the individual substance of the memo and of DFAD's recommendations, that I was particularly proud that we managed to create a memo that made recommendations across DFAD's policy priorities. Everything that DFAD wants, that DFAD has been pushing for, is covered in this memo to a certain extent, right? We have a voting access and voting protection element. We have a number of election security elements. We have a number of good government transparency reform ideas. We have a number of anti-corruption ideas, including probably one of our biggest priorities right now, which is making government contractors disclose their political spending. And then we had a couple at the very end that I particularly, and I think folks here might particularly be interested in, which is including, for example, encouraging the administration to use the new beneficial ownership registry that was created a few years ago to track foreign contributions and spending in our elections, which I think is a very interesting idea. So I will turn it back now.
Thank you so much, Gabe. And if any of you are interested at all in digging more into what our executive order memo looks like, it is on our website. Excuse me. I apologize. Goodness. I apologize for that. dfad.org. I have some water, please. Thank you. I must have, all the talking, must have gotten a dry throat. But, so if you would like to kind of go a little more into, thank you so much. Thank you, much better. So if you want to dig more into the memo that Gabe just talked about, you feel free to go to our website, like I said, dfad.org, and it really, really shows the work that went into this memo and kind of all of the moving parts of it. And actually, one of the big sections of that memo, and I'll turn this over to Lisa for her to talk a little more about this, but part of the work of the coalition is combating the influence of big and secret money in politics. And earlier this year, Senate Republicans blocked a vote on the Disclose Act. We were trying to do things without an executive order and going through Congress. And the filibuster got in the way of passing sweeping democracy reform. So Lisa, can you speak to us about what the president can do right now to combat secret money in politics and its impact for the rest of us?
Definitely. Thanks, Allison. And I'll also just give kudos to Gabe for the incredible work on the memo that he talked about. Excited to be able to share this little component of it. So taking a step back, I'm sure folks in this room are familiar, but secret money is a huge problem in the United States. There are two types of political spending that can happen in our country. One is direct spending, money that goes right to campaigns or political action committees or to the parties, and we know all about that spending. It's disclosed, we understand where it's coming from, and we can make decisions as voters when we see advertisements funded by those entities. We know the source of the money. The other huge bucket of spending in America is secret. It is dark money, and it was enabled in a very overreaching Supreme Court case called Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which happened at this point almost 13 years ago. So Citizens United allowed this tsunami of what I'll call indirect spending. So basically corporations or millionaires or billionaires can funnel their money through conduits. So it goes through a nonprofit or it goes through a trade association. We could almost call it money laundering, something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the problem with that is if you see an advertisement on the TV that says, this political idea was brought to you by, Citizens for Puppies and Happiness, you don't know, that maybe that ad was paid for by Exxon, and the candidate that they're saying is so great is actually a climate denier. And so it is a huge problem that this money is flowing through our political system, and we have no way as voters, as citizens, to understand where it's coming from. So at this point, the amounts are enormous. I think the number is over $1 billion in secret money spent in 2020. And we've tried to deal with it legislatively, as Allison just said. We tried to pass legislation called the Disclose Act, which would have gotten to the bottom of this spending. We tried to put the Disclose Act into a larger, sweeping piece of legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act, which of course was blocked, as we discussed earlier, by just 2 Senate votes and the inability to reform the filibuster. So now we are turning to the administration and we are saying, what can you do? What can happen unilaterally with a stroke of a pen to get at some of this secret political spending? And the good news is there is something they can do. It is requiring all large government contractors to disclose their political spending. So this would be hugely impactful because government contractors are often also our largest corporations. So these same entities like Exxon, like Amazon, they're selling things to our government. Our taxpayer dollars are going to, them providing the computers for our employees, for, creating the oil that, we use to get government vehicles all around the country. We are paying them, but we don't know, if they are actually the right entities to be getting these contracts, or maybe they're getting these contracts because they spent the most in politics, and so our government decided to reward them. So that is certainly not okay. And so we are advocating strongly for the Biden administration to issue this order. It would have a really big impact right away because of the 100 largest companies, 52 of them are government contractors. So again, a huge swath of disclosure would happen instantly if we could make this happen. So that's the executive order that we're pushing for. It was included in the memo that Gabe mentioned. I think, in terms of impact, of course, dark money is a problem for all the reasons I just mentioned. We want to get to the bottom of secret political money because we're voters and we deserve to know, because we're taxpayers and we deserve to know, but also because of the possibility of corruption. And that's, of course, what this conference is all about. The idea that our taxpayer dollars could be going to the least qualified contractor, that's corrupting. And even if that's not happening, the idea that it could be, this sort of appearance of corruption, is also a problem. And so it is certainly in the Biden administration's best interest to issue this order. We feel that they are interested. We have brought it to the administration in a couple different forums, and so we're hopeful. I think one of the things that makes us the most hopeful is that it's politically savvy for them to do this. So the last, you folks may be aware, we're still in the middle of a Georgia election, but we just came out of our 2022 midterms. And there was impressive turnout. And one of the reasons people turned out to vote is because they are fearful of the direction our democracy is heading. They are worried, that it's been captured by special interests. They are worried that election deniers have seized power or are trying to seize power. And that's one of the reasons that they came out to the polls. And this is something that Biden actually leaned into a lot in the lead up to the election. He gave speeches about the threats to our democracy, the concerns about MAGA Republicans and the narratives that they've been pushing. And so since we were much more successful, Democrats were much more successful in this election than you would have imagined, there's a little bit of a mandate coming out of that. People turned out because they care about democracy, and so the president should now do something about democracy. And so that is the case that we're making to him, why it is politically smart to take action right now, using, again, a stroke of a pen, doing executive action on lots of topics, but especially on this one, on dark money, on dealing with secret political spending through this executive order. So happy to answer questions on this, but again, we're hopeful that it can happen. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. And actually, another kind of area where dark money finds itself causing problems is in the climate area. And so, Justin, if you could talk about, coming from the climate space, can you share how pushing these democracy reforms, specifically through executive action right now, affect your work, and how they connect the dots between how climate policy and democracy reform kind of get us where we want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think, as I said earlier, we really see that the inability to pass climate legislation is a direct result of our democracy. And so when we look at who are the companies, who are the organizations that are spending the most in these dark money forms, we know that it's oil companies, we know that it's energy companies, and we know these are the exact same companies that are polluting neighborhoods, that are polluting our waterways, that are polluting that are using that influence within our government in order to do all the irreversible harm to our country, to our world, right? That we're fighting against it every day. And so that's why, we truly, truly believe that like these two fights are absolutely connected. And so I think that's why also we're so wholeheartedly interested in joining this democracy fight. But what I will say is, and one thing that's really great about the DFA coalition is, I'm the only one person here that's not in the policy space. I'm more in the movement space. I'm more in the grassroots space. And so letting these folks do the work, but then having a group like DFAD in order to then give us those onboard ramps in order to be able to talk out about these issues or be able to put our own personal spin on these issues to our memberships is so important. And it's an incredible investment that can be made. So when we had the opportunity to sign on to a letter to the Biden administration saying that we wanted to pass this executive order, what us and other environmental groups actually looked at the letter and we said, we actually have our own version of this that we wanted to do, and we're able to create our own version, putting our own statistics and messaging regarding specifically the environment. And we're able to send that to ourselves. And I think it only happened because it's been years of investment in order to say like, hey, here's how you need to talk about this money in politics. Here's why it's important to you. And then eventually we could take the ball and run with it. And the last thing I would say about that, how it affects our work is it really then helps us connect it to the larger issues. So over these past couple of years, we've really promoted that, as we said, we can't have a healthy environment without a healthy democracy. And in addition to working in Washington, D.C., we also have 32 other state leagues that are doing various works on the ground in different communities. And we're passing that information along to them so that they're passing along to the individuals on the ground to make these issues something that really connects to them. We talked a little bit earlier about the Morby Harper decision. North Carolina League of Conservation Voters, one of our affiliates, is one of the plaintiffs, one of the co-plaintiffs on that lawsuit. We are doing a lot of different things on the ground in order to build up the momentum in the communities that will eventually reach its way up to what's happening here in DC. And so I think, continuing to invest, continuing to engage the climate communities, education communities, health communities in these democracy issues and making those connections is extremely important to hopefully the long-term advancement of the work that we're doing. And so really happy to be working with all these individuals in that capacity.
Thanks so much, Justin. And so now we're going to open the floor up we have time for a few questions, and then also we have people joining us virtually, online. So hello to all the people online. And so we'll also be taking some questions from the chat, but any questions? Yes.
So I'm Brazilian, and we are in a kind of a border of a mess, literally, because it's the Trump ideas and Steve Bannon being executed in a country that has no limits. So, and also we have a huge problem with Amazonia with Bolsonaro, which is crazy. I help a lot of indigenous chiefs, and for instance, one of them, they killed the father spanking in front of her, and afterwards they rape the niece of 13 years old. So, and they are basically the keepers of the clan. So we have both things. United States is trying to kind of limit the crazy things that is going on in Brazil, and I'm so thankful for this because in Brazil everything gets through, no? So how can we create something like a board or a group of people to kind of protect democracies and protect some basic things like climate change is not regarding one country, it's regarding the whole planet. So if it shrinks, if everybody dies. So it's like, how can be created something like a kind of a group of people that can work the boundaries of some things in a unbounded world or whatever we can name it? how can it, and I think the United States is the country to lead this, because in a way, it's a democracy that is really democracy. Like in Brazil, they see elections as a World Cup. They just think about presidents and governors. They don't care about senators or Congress. They don't interact with them. So how can we create something that is more a safe space for citizens broadly, and the democracy and climate and the basic things, the pillars that we need to have in the world today?
This is open to, I guess, anyone.
I'll kick it off and just say that's such an important question, and in a lot of ways, exactly what Transparency International is trying to achieve, and the individual institutions and nonprofits around the country that are, or around the world, that are coming together at this conference to try to think through where our synergies are and how we can work together to do exactly what you're saying. I mean, there are huge problems. What we've been discussing today is domestic. It's how our system is broken and how we want to fix it. But obviously, multitudes greater, problems in Brazil, and then in many other countries as well. There are a few things that the American government is doing that are a little bit like what you're discussing. So the Summit for Democracy that some folks have, I'm sure, participated in this room is loosely intended to pull together nations around democracy commitments that we can all hold to and move towards. Again, sort of institutions that work internationally, like Transparency International, are trying to do what you're saying, but I don't think we've gone as far as what you're saying, which is just this sort of existing board that gathers to talk big issues. And so would love to work with you and pursue it, and I know many at this conference would want to do that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, something that we've tried to do with the DFAC conference is exactly this, and I think it is, it does need to start with kind of some of the issue areas, specifically like the environment and all the other issue areas, committing to make democracy their number 2 issue, I think. And I think it takes a lot of, like I say, work and conversations with folks, but I think it really does come from the organizations with the closest connection to the people on the ground, getting them together and saying, like, hey, we care enough about this to where, even though this is what our main thing is, like, we understand how important this is as our second thing, and we will unite and kind of push both of these things together because they are interconnected. And so obviously it's a lot easier than it sounds. I mean, I know I'm just saying this from behind a microphone, but connecting it back to the people with the organizations that are dealing with the issues that people care about, finding a way to gather them together, to give that 10% of their time in order to go to this one particular issue is probably the best way to start.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Lisa mentioned the Democracy Summit. I think a number of probably folks in this room have been a little bit disappointed by the progress that we've made through that, and the progress that we've made with U.S. government through that. So I'll just say that one of the models that the DFED coalition provides, I think, could be scaled to the international level. Outside of focusing on governments and what the governments can do, right? We've had a lot of success coming up with policies, coming up with advocacy strategies, engaging with the government on the domestic side to make these reforms. But I don't see why that model wouldn't work on the international level. It would be complicated, and it would require connection to folks on the ground in far more places than we're talking about in DFAD, but I don't see why the model necessarily wouldn't scale. So, I'm really interested. I know Crew has been working really hard to connect our democracy, our individual and domestic side democracy and anti-corruption work with all of the international groups and the international work that we've been doing, and especially in you can see those synergies, especially in things like anti-corruption and financial corruption stuff that we've been working on. So yeah, I'd be interested. I think we all would be in pursuing this.
So I would agree with what Justin said about building out the pro-democracy groups and broadening how you define those, which we're all doing right now. I think that's very important. I also would say this, to look to unlikely allies Something that we did with the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill is we went to corporations, to Fortune 500 companies, and basically said, you know, you guys have been sitting out the democracy issues for a very long time. And it's really important to your employees that they be, you know, able to participate, that they be able to cast a vote unchallenged. It's important to your customers. And really, it's important to a healthy economy to have a healthy democracy. And lo and behold, we got 250 big businesses to sign support for the John Lewis bill. And, you know, we've only begun in that realm. And so we connected those dots for them, made the ask to them, which I think hadn't been done for a very long time. So that's something.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm Claudia Vascabergo from Boston Institute on Governance. Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. I love how you're framing, you know, how you strategize and formulate your priorities in a context where sweeping reform is not possible, but for incremental change, how you're targeting the executive orders as the vehicle to do so. So my question is about the sustainability. So assuming, and I really hope that the executive orders that you're promoting will succeed. They sound wonderful. But how do you think in the longer term about sustainability? Because, you know, I know the previous president was also using executive orders quite extensively. So how do we, you know, assuming that these incremental gains are achieved, what can we do beyond to try to strategically promote more ownership and raising the stakes for these changes, these incremental changes, not to be, you know, backtracked, say, by a future other administration? And I guess the hidden question inside my question is, how do you think about polarization, fake news, fear-mongering, all these kind of nasty things that can be used to turn good policies down? How do we think strategically about these topics?
Thank you. Who would like to tackle that one first?
I mean,
Go ahead.
I can, unless we want to just do cross the line again.
Sure.
That might make sense, yeah.
Well, I mean, to the question of executive orders and whether they will last, the obvious answer is they are for this executive, and so we cannot guarantee that it'll be in place in a future administration. That said, I think something like an executive order requiring contractors disclose their political spending, it will cause corporate change. And so as soon as a corporation has to change their corporate governance to put these disclosures out there in order to get contracts, oftentimes, once those changes are made, they're not backtracked. It's something that shareholders begin to expect. It's something that, you know, becomes a norm as people think about investing in companies. And so I do think this particular EO, should we win it, we have high hopes that we can continue to keep it in place, even if a future administration discontinued the actual requirement for contractors. So on that discrete order, that is my answer. If we win, I hope we can keep it. It's not the case across the board, but certainly, you know, important for anything that tackles corporate power. To the other part of your question, just sort of, you know, how does winning on these things impact, you know, how people are feeling about democracy, how people are feeling about disinformation and lack of trust in government, and just all of the problems we're facing right now. Doing this, winning these orders, is actually one of the things that I think is essential to fighting that problem. I think we need to show that things can still be won. You know, whether it's a small order that lasts 2 years or 6 years, we'll see, or it's something else, you know, that happens at the federal level. I think people are disheartened about the ability to win things. Coming within a breath of a sweeping legislative victory and not winning has caused many activists around the country to feel like it's not possible to win. And so it's more important than ever that we succeed at the executive level, and it's one of the reasons our coalition is spending so much time on it.
Yeah, sure. I could not agree more with that last point. You know, people believe in democracy when government can get stuff done and when they can make real change. If you can go out and see improvements in your life or in the system that are actually real, that are not, you know, just kind of ephemeral. That's how we, you know, convince people that the system or that the democracy still works, even if the system itself is sort of ill and whatnot. Like, this is, that's how we do it. So like, even if these, or some of these policies only last, 1, 2 years, people will see that that's happening, and some of them are, policies and ideas that will help, that sort of self-enforce, right? So if we create, say, a high-profile task force to protect the right to vote and protect access to voting, that will help in the 2024 election, right? And trying to help elect pro-democracy, or help the people elect pro-democracy candidates. But no, you're right. This is a real problem. I think there is another vehicle that we've been working through, and I know I keep mentioning the Corporate Transparency Act and financial corruption, but the other vehicle is regulatory change, right? The executive isn't just moved by executive orders, it's also moved via the regulatory process, and it's much, much harder to change and get rid of regulations. Those are things that, when they're passed, they stick, and they require a new regulation to change and get rid of them. So they also create an immense change in the way people behave, right? More than arguably almost anything else, regulations are the things that touch everyone's daily lives. So we've been looking at ways to make regulatory change. I mean, the process is slow, but when it's done, you've made something that's quasi-law. And for example, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has finalized a truly fantastic rule implementing the Corporate Transparency Act's various provisions on beneficial ownership, and that is going to touch almost every corporation in the entire country. And it's going to completely, completely change the way the United States approaches anti-money laundering and financial corruption. And that is the result of a law that we passed, but the regulation is what is making this law so powerful and so effective. So that's another thing to think about.
And I guess I would say both questions were great. Ditto about the regulations, but even the executive order, it's why we're jumping up and down to try to get them to do as much as possible now so that the agencies can reach down into their programs and their crevices and put things in place that are harder. It's, obviously they can be undone by another administration, but it's harder. It takes time. It takes effort. Are they really going to take off the, multiple languages that vote.gov is adding onto the website? Are they really going to remove those in another administration? Some things are kind of designed to stick. On the second question, I would say this: the misinformation, disinformation threat is as, large and as devastating as any of us have seen in the voting rights, world, since we've been doing this work. It grew and grew and became, I think, one of the most significant impediments to just getting good information about where to vote, how to vote. We saw disinformation being directed to communities of color in particular, giving them wrong information, bad information about how to engage in democracy. So it's a huge threat. We actually have a disinformation person on staff now on our voting rights team. It's that bad. And I would say it's not going away. This notion, this takeaway from the elections, some of the more notorious election deniers lost their elections, and we are very grateful for that, okay? But some also won. And so it's not going away. It's something that we need to keep front of mind and to counter and be vigilant as we track them, push back, but also shape our own narrative to advance.
Sorry, you were,
Yeah.
and then.
I'm from Panama, and you were addressing the issue of dark money. So let's say we got darker money, okay? The one that doesn't go through an NGO, the one that translates into hats, T-shirts, construction blocks, sands, whatever, okay? And those donors, they do not have to declare it. They don't want to declare it, as a matter of fact. They don't need to deduct it because 60-something contractors right now are donors of are contractors with the government. at what point it could backfire into their political system, one. And two, how do you address the darker money? Because sometimes it's even larger than the one that goes through NGO. In Panama, you can go through NGOs to sponsor politicians, and there are regulations that put caps on the amount of money that corporations can do it. But then you can have 4 or 5 corporations donating to the same guy. So basically, she says that those have two questions: the Biden administration and the darker.
Yeah, I mean, you know, why would any set of politicians decide to disarm in any way, right, is the question. So they're currently operating under the system we're in. In some ways, they're winning, so why would they change what they're doing? And that is, it's a good question. It's the question of campaign finance reform writ large. You know, I would just say that one party has been far more inclined to make those changes than the other. And I think there is actually a moral commitment that they have made to support it, to you know, we understand that they're going to use the system we inhabit until it doesn't exist anymore, but they are willing to advocate for the changes that we need to make it better. And so that has proven true. You know, we haven't won yet, but that has proven true, you know, with every legislative vehicle that would tackle secret political spending. And we think the same should and has to be true for what they do via executive order. And it's part of our advocacy to them. You know, you're on the record saying this is the right thing to do, so now do it. So that's Biden. You know, in terms of money that is darker than dark, you know, it's not exactly what we have, you know, in terms of the setup here. There are just kind of 2 types of spending that we know about, and that which runs through these conduit entities. And so we do have some clear remedies for how to get back, you know, behind those conduits. But I'd love to talk to you more about what we might do to be helpful with what you're grappling with in Panama.
I'll just add, corruption is poison for democracy. When people see contractors buying contracts from the government like that via like secret donations, they abandon and believe that democracy is rigged, and it fuels all of the disinformation. It fuels everything that everyone is talking about. This is a central element of the fight for democracy here and abroad. And especially when it comes to darker than dark money, that is not it's not a problem that affects individual states. It's a problem that affects everyone at the same time. And that's why we, as a domestic coalition, work so closely with Transparency International on so many of our issues, right? Corruption is something that, you know, everyone from, you know, the classic, you know, all of our anti-corruption organizations to people that you would never think about as supporting or caring so much about this, care so much about it. And I'll just say, there are remedies to that problem. The fundamental issue with that type of structure is that we don't know who owns, right, the shell corporations that are making those donations. So if you have some amount of corporate transparency, you could eventually track the money back up to the people who are ultimately trying to buy contracts from the government. So that is not something that the United States should be lecturing anyone on. We are incredibly opaque when it comes to that stuff, but that's why we're trying to fight to get more corporate transparency, more of this anti-corruption stuff as part of our democracy issue. And we actually have a couple, like I said, a couple of suggestions in our executive orders about that. But that's sort of my 2 cents on corporate transparency.
Thank you. We have time for one more question right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Gilbert. I work with Transparency International of Kenya. So without prejudice to any politician here or parliamentarian, you find that in some of our parliaments, the parliamentarians are the most beneficiaries to gaps in anti-corruption legislation, and more so when you come to dirty money in politics. And therefore, sometimes you have to contend very shallow legislation or frameworks, legal frameworks that are not effective. And of course, using the judicial processes, public interest litigation, you can get interpretations that are more favorable to what you're looking for. But I'm thinking in terms of probably commitment, like at regional or international level on basic frameworks or minimum standards for disclosure have legislation that is effective to deal with political finances.
I'm going to tackle that one.
I was thinking, thought you might.
I mean, in terms of minimum standards that can work across the board, I think I would defer to you, Gabe, in terms of what we're recommending. But certainly that's something that we are supportive of as a global idea. So I'll let
Yeah.
you flesh it out.
Perhaps you should talk after, because there's a lot. We have a lot to say about this stuff. Sorry. I'm not sure that our campaign finance and regime is really the best model for this. We do our best with it, but there's a lot that we have to do to change this. And I'll just give one example of why that's true. Crew has been litigating against a dark money group that violated clearly the minimum standards for reporting of donations in 2010. And we just, like 2 months ago, finally won our case at the DC Circuit to get the information behind who donated to that organization that violated the law. That's the structure that we operate in, and our partially it's because of our deeply broken Federal Election Commission regulatory structure that simply will not do investigations even into organizations that have completely broken the law. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that.
Thank you, Gabe. And so I know we've got a hard stop at 11, and so we've got a couple of minutes left. And so I just want our panel to close out for us, and we'll just go down the line. And I will start with Leslie. What opportunities for reform are you most excited about pursuing in the new year, and some strategies? Like, what is there? If there's like a one thing that's like you're really excited about.
Well, I have to start and stop with what the Supreme Court has been doing to our laws. I mean, you talked about, I was thinking it was a little bit the opposite for us. We had some good laws, not great, but we had some good laws on the books for a very long time, and the court has taken them away. And so we have to go back to the legislature to get them back on the books. And, as I said at the beginning, this is the long haul, and we need to be, persistent and insistent. But I would also say that I think we gain from signaling that we're not lowering our expectations because the House is suddenly in the hands of the Republicans by a razor-thin margin, that we're not going away, that we have the same agenda. We have a bipartisan agenda, a nonpartisan agenda to protect democracy, to use the pluses and the gains and the talking points we got out of this election, that it wasn't, the sky did not fall in as we were preparing for and expecting, with a lot of forms, not only voter suppression, but, political violence, election sabotage, criminalization of voters, disinformation. We had soup to nuts, everything that could possibly be being put into place was in place, and we were prepared to deal with it. Not everything we were preparing for, eventuated and resulted, and we could take some hope from that, and and build on that, but signal that we're not going away, and that no kind of political calculus is changing our minds about what we need and what everybody should be supporting regardless of party. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Gabe?
I'm not going to talk too long because I've sort of dominated. I'm sorry about that. I'm most excited for two things, so sorry. First is going back to the ethics titles that we had in HR 1, which was the big policy package that DFAD was instrumental in drafting, which was actually pared down into the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We had an entire title on ethics and good government reforms, including transparency, anti-corruption in the executive branch, and in the judiciary, which obviously is desperately in need of reform. So I'm very excited about that. I think there are a lot of different things in there that were bipartisan at the time that we can pull back out. So I'm excited about that. The other thing that I'm excited about that I've got some hope about is what I said earlier, that the fight against corruption is a fight for democracy. And it's a fight that is not limited to one side of the political spectrum. It is a bipartisan, it is a cross-ideological fight. And we've seen that in a lot of our work. So finding ways to fight corruption both internationally and domestically, and finding those synergies between the two, and kind of expanding all of this work with you all to bring home the fact that the fight against corruption internationally is an integral fight, part of the fight against corruption in the United States, and that all of that is a fight for democracy here and abroad. Because like I said, corruption is poison for democracy. So that's a big priority and something that I'm excited about given our successes.
Justin.
Sure. I'm going to go in a little bit different direction than this, but it's still very important, still connected to the work that we're doing. But we have also, as League of Conservation Voters, really invested in working on judiciary work. And I think when you look at some of the Supreme Court decisions that have happened and that are going to come up, I think the public really is starting to understand how influential the courts are in fighting for all the things that we care about, not just at the Supreme Court level, but also at the lower court levels, obviously, since how those decisions are written affects how the Supreme Court works. And so we've gone both, nominating judges both on the federal as well as local levels, as well as we've also came with the position that we want to expand the Supreme Court. So I think that's also some interesting ways to adjust the judiciary in order to start to see some of the results of democracy that we're hoping to see. I think it's really, really interesting, and I think it's going to then tie back into all the other work that we're talking about, and really looking forward to seeing where that goes over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Justin.
Well, thanks for the question, because I am just super excited. I think that we have a lot of opportunity looking at us in the next 2 years. I think, I've been working personally on disclosure issues, on trying to shine a light on secret money for 13 years since the Citizens United decision. And I am so hopeful that the Biden administration will actually take action and require this swath of dark money be brought into the sunlight. And so that's an exciting space to be in. I think it's important that we take this action for energizing people around the country, for showing that victories can happen at the federal level, for reacting to what happened 2 years ago, the January 6th insurrection, and showing that our country can still achieve things on democracy when so much of it seems to be in decline. So I think this is an optimistic moment, and I'll just close by saying this conference is optimistic, and us coming together to think about how we can do things domestically and how it partners with and marries with the incredible work that all of you are doing in your own nations and the synergies we can create. So thanks for having us, Allison, and for that question.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our amazing panel for just all of your insight and wisdom. Thank you to you, the audience, for your attention and your questions as well. We have come to the end of our panel, and we'll be, myself and Christine, and I know some of our panel has to skedaddle, and some will be able to stay maybe and have chats with you afterwards, but we really appreciate you taking the time to come and listen to us. So, and I know this is one of the first workshops of the whole convention, so hopefully everyone will continue on to have a good conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.